Hi, I'm Lara, and this is tropetrinitytrilogy, and today I'll be reviewing Little Birds by Hannah Lee Kidder. So Hannah Lee Kidder is an author-tuber, and it's been a while since I watched her videos. When I did watch them, I enjoyed them. However, they will have no effect on my review right now. In college, I took several creative writing classes, and in a lot of creative writing classes, you read and write short stories, and I read tons of short stories. And in that class, I really grew to appreciate the form of short stories, and recently I've been wanting to read more of them because getting back into writing, I want to edit the short stories I've written and write more and see if I can send some of them to magazines because I think short stories are great and you can read tons free online. However, I decided to check out this collection because I thought it would appeal to me. I genuinely did. And with this collection, I got it on Kindle Unlimited for free too, which definitely helped in my decision to get it. And then I read it and I realized I was not really a fan. Before I go in depth on why I felt this way about the book, I'm gonna read the blurb. So it is: this best-selling debut of short stories is a collection of glimpses into some of the darkest corners of our lives, the lies we tell ourselves, the ways we hurt others, the painful truths we pretend to face. Each story is a raw, unflinchingly human experience. Dun dun! So this collection features 13 stories, some of which are flash fiction and only 2 sentences, but these stories are: Dear Emma, What Remains by the Window, Qui Vive, I don't know. He Wrote Me a Song, An Envelope, Cropstet, Winnow, Ignorance, Wolverine Frogs, Little Birds, Green, and Cane Sprouts. So do I think these stories fit the blurb? Well, sort of, but not really. So these definitely aren't feel-good stories. However, besides 4 of them, the rest of the 13 I felt were more melancholy and not necessarily the darkest experience of the human life, or whatever the quote was. And even some of the darker topics in the stories came across to me as more melancholy due to how they were approached. Based on the blurb, I would expect more corrupt protagonist, grief, rage. I expected this collection to evoke strong emotions from me. Now, most of the stories did actually deal with grief or loss or holding on to the past, so I guess it could be kind of like grief of the past. But the way that the stories are approached, the characters tend to deal with these issues in a very detached way, not directly, which not saying every story needs to be directly like, this is the thing that's wrong and this is a character dealing with it, because that's not necessarily good writing. However, this kind of also resulted in me feeling detached to everything and not necessarily feeling as invested, because that's all the characters' coping mechanisms. And so it's not necessarily the most interesting feeling a story can evoke from me. Because if they're indifferent to their lives, as the reader, I end up mirroring their emotions and I'm indifferent to their lives too, which is not the goal of a story. And to be honest, some of these stories I felt followed protagonists whose lives were more boring than the average person in real life. And it's like, I'm not reading a story to read something more boring than my actual life. It's not that I necessarily think I have an exceptionally boring life or anything like that. I mean, these characters don't feel like they've earned the right to be protagonists because they aren't interesting. Now, if you want to read a quiet, melancholy book, this collection is for you. However, when I read books or short stories in general, I want to feel something. I want to feel strong emotions. And melancholy, like if a collection has a couple melancholy stories, that's fine. But if that's what pretty much all of them make me feel, it's not my favorite thing. That's not what I want from a story. I want to feel something more strongly. Short stories can't spend as much time developing a complex plot or world. However, they can develop complex characters and they can have a real punch at the end of the story. In fact, that emotional punch is one of the great aspects of short stories. And while some of these short stories did achieve the emotional punch, when it came to the characters, most of the protagonists felt very samey to me and like they could be swapped out for the protagonist of other stories within the collection. The protagonists all seem to be quiet people who are living in the past, which is fine for a couple stories. However, when all the stories feature protagonists like that, they begin to blend together. 4 of the stories involved breakups, and 3 of them involved protagonists who were longing over exes. And reading 3 stories about characters who can't get over the ex, first of all, I don't think that's one of the darkest corners of the human experience. I mean, maybe in some cases, but it felt more like just people who can't move on. And when they have the same issues and they all have the same quiet demeanor, the stories don't really stand out to me. And it feels almost like the advertisement for this collection wasn't accurate to what I got. When you have 4 stories about characters who are in breakups, and I will say the first one did have an added layer of grief to it, so it was unique, but when 3 of them are just characters who can't move on from the ex, that makes the collection start to feel repetitive. Now, I will admit the short story The Envelope was one of the ones I enjoyed more, and that was about a breakup, but even then, the stories with more unique topics didn't always appeal to me. So even though The Envelope was one of the ones that was kind of repetitive in topic, that I still enjoyed despite that, a lot of the characters' personalities and emotional struggles in a less specific sense still felt very similar to me. I think part of why these stories felt very samey to me is that Kidder's writing style is very simple and didn't really vary from character to character. They didn't necessarily have very distinct voices, in my opinion. Now, the writing in itself was fine. It respected the reader's intelligence and didn't dumb itself down to explicitly tell us this is what the character's thinking and this is what you're supposed to get out of the story. It expected us to make inferences and respected our intelligence. Instead, the writing gave us clues based on the character's actions, about what happened with them, about their experiences, and the emotional states they are in because of this history they went through. And I do think The Envelope did this fairly well. However, again, when most of the characters are quiet, unassuming people living in the past, it gets repetitive. That I know I'm being repetitive in my description of how this book is repetitive, but I think that's the biggest flaw of this collection. The story that I think actually evoked the most emotion for me was Cane Sprouts, which I think this was because this story had a slightly more uplifting end to it. So when every story kind of just was dreary and melancholy with negative endings, it was a nice change of pace. Despite my critiques, I don't want you to think these stories are bad, because I genuinely don't think they were bad stories. The stories Dear Emma and He Wrote Me a Song had nice emotional punches at the end of the story, while other stories such as An Envelope and Cane Sprouts had satisfying bookends that tied the story up in a neat bow. Wolverine Frogs also had bookends, however that story was more depressing than satisfying. Not that a story can't be depressing or have a negative ending. Which An Envelope and Cane Sprouts were probably my 2 favorite stories in the collection. However, the other 3 I just mentioned, in having those nice endings or punches, even then, they didn't really get to me and they didn't have any emotional impact for me personally. However, I will say some of the stories were kind of bland to me, especially the story Winnow. That story felt like it was just following around a random character for a random segment of her life, like not a full story, but some random chunks from a novel. And she was also just this bland, uninteresting protagonist who didn't really warrant her own story. And it felt like the story didn't have a proper ending because it didn't feel like a story. It felt like a bunch of random scenes from this boring, depressing lady's life. Winnow best demonstrates an issue I have with a fair amount of the stories. And that is, it doesn't feel like a complete story, but instead a couple scenes from just randomly taken from a novel that don't have a proper beginning and end. And Cane Sprouts, despite being one of the ones I enjoyed more because of the more unique emotions at the end, even that one felt like a bunch of scenes from a story. Even though it did kind of have bookends, it wasn't necessarily a story that I was like, yes, That is a great short story. It's kind of like, what else is there though? Where's the rest? However, also when it came to stories that ended with the big emotional punch or shock, those stories I even didn't really care for that much, because all those stories had was the shock. They didn't have compelling characters, they didn't have interesting events, and while some of the prose was fine, a shock at the end of a story that I don't care about isn't going to make me care about it all of a sudden at the end. I felt like with those stories, the idea for the story was nice, but the execution was lacking. Also, this critique I'm about to say will not affect my rating of this collection because it might be personal bias and taste, but there were 3 two-sentence stories in this collection and none of them did anything for me. I'm not going to tell you them all, but I will recite the first one right now, and that is, "I don't sleep. If I wait up long enough, you might come home." Which honestly, it's hard to make 2 sentences revolutionary, but to me it read almost like insta poetry, and I don't think I'd ever want to pay to read something that feels like insta poetry when I could just read it on Instagram for free. And also, something about that story, it's not that those specific sentences are taking from something, but it doesn't feel that unique to me. It doesn't feel like it's bringing something new to the table, which again, not every story needs to, but when it's that short and it doesn't evoke emotion for me and it's something I've seen before, I don't really have anything great to say about it. It's just kind of there. However, since flash fiction is not my thing, my judgment of this collection is based on the 10 actual short stories instead of out of all 13. However, even out of the 10, I didn't like the majority of those stories either. Also, while some of these stories did feel like they had a clear message or theme, there were others where they just felt aimless, had a trite theme or message, or felt like something I had seen earlier in the collection and was just repetitive. 12 of the 13 stories in this collection focused on someone who's living in the past and can't move on. And the 12th time it gets boring. It's not interesting the 12th time in a row, or at least it wasn't done in a unique or creative enough way in this collection to keep it interesting. I get what they were clinging to in the past did vary within the stories, but usually how they clung on to it wasn't very varied. It was mostly them just sulking and being boring. But reading about 12 different boring people clinging to the past doesn't pique my interest personally. I think the easiest way for me to summarize my feelings of the Little Birds collection is while each individual story is proficient within itself and well written, I don't think they worked together well as a collection. I think the biggest issue is how it was curated. If I had read any of these other stories in a magazine beforehand, I might have enjoyed them. I don't think any of them would have been a new favorite, but they still could have been fun. Now, some of these stories I still would have enjoyed more than others. However, I think each individual story would have left more of an impact if they had been with other stories that were more unique and creative compared to them. There just wasn't enough variety. I think overall these stories don't work together as a collection. They feel too repetitive and samey, resulting in each of them losing their impact because of what they're surrounded by. And this results in my overall reading experience being meh. I read this collection all at once. However, if you do plan on reading it, I do think the better way to read it would be to spread out each story. I don't mean to sound harsh. I do think each individual story does demonstrate Kidder's skill and maturity in her writing, and the fact that she respects the reader's intelligence and doesn't just tell us what her characters are thinking. And I do think some of the stories had nice bookends and were well thought out. But the curation of the collection was lacking. And for me personally, I don't know if I find Kidder's writing to be interesting or varied enough for me to ever really enjoy a whole collection of her stories. However, I am going to give her second collection a chance, so we'll see if I feel the same way for that one. Anyway, what are your thoughts? Have you read this collection? Did you like it or dislike it? Do you plan on reading it? What do you think? Let me know all your thoughts down below, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you later.